podcast of the PPO, podcast about everything from the world of public procurement.
Dear listeners, welcome to another episode of Public Procurement Office podcast. Today I have a special guest, Mrs. Caroline Nicholas. Dear Caroline, could you please introduce us and tell us how did you get to public procurement?
Thank you, and thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, I'm Caroline Nicholas, and I joined the world of procurement, more years ago than I'd like to admit, I think. Like most people, quite unexpectedly. I joined UNCITRAL, which is the UN Commission on International Trade Law, and although I'd worked in a lot of their areas, they said to me, could you go and look at public procurement? I have to confess I didn't really know what it was. And UNCITRAL as a UN body is very much involved in trade and development. And so they look at public procurement through that trade and development lens, the idea being that improving public procurement systems can help international trade, can help development and so forth. So it was policy and law, and with that I worked a lot with other international organisations in public procurement, developing rules, developing policies, implementing rules at the national level, and doing a lot of internationally focused and domestic implementation of procurement rules.
So it was more focused on the states?
So yes, as all UN bodies, UNCITRAL has members of UN member states as its own members. And what we were doing was preparing policies and national templates for national laws to help drive up standards at the national level in public procurement. So UNCITRAL's major export, if you like, on the procurement front is called the UNCITRAL Model Law on Public Procurement. And that's a template for all countries anywhere in the world to use for their primary procurement legislation. So a little bit like the EU directives, but, and we can talk about this perhaps later on, it has a different focus. It's designed very much for what does a national system need, and then international obligations are built on the top.
And then how is it in collaboration exactly with the European Union and their directives? Do you talk together, do conversation, or make some agreements?
Yes, we do. So when I was leading the work in UNCITRAL, so that's 15, 20 years ago, the EU was in the process of putting together what are now the current directives. And we were updating an older UNCITRAL model law. So we talked to each other. Institutionally, these things are sometimes a little bit more difficult because of the different memberships and so forth. But we exchanged a lot of information about what we were proposing to do, because both of us recognised, and I think the international community recognises more generally, that it's very important to try and harmonise procurement rules for several reasons. The first is, if everybody has the same rules, it makes international trade and commerce much easier, because you're not trying to learn completely different sets of rules to be able to sell overseas. And then procurement markets, which are huge, obviously that's very important. Secondly, if we all have the same rules, we can share experience about what works and what doesn't work much more easily. So it's a good capacity building tool. And thirdly, imagine if you're a procurement official in a country that might be dealing with building infrastructure that's financed nationally. There might be an EU finance project, there might be a World Bank finance project, and you're dealing with 3 projects at the same time. That's 3 completely different sets of rules. Hopeless in terms of allowing you to focus on outcomes. Fortunately, there's a lot of consensus on what makes good procurement rules. We all want transparency, competition, and all those sorts of things. The key difference, I think, between these various systems is not do we disagree about advertising opportunities and all that sort of thing. It's what the procurement system is really designed to do. So in the EU, it's about implementing the single market. For the UN Convention Against Corruption, that's got a procurement article, clues in the name, preventing corruption. The World Trade Organization has its agreement on government procurement. That's about liberalising world trade. The UNCITRAL model law, as I say, focuses on what does a national system need and build your international obligations on top. And so unlike the EU directives, for example, it doesn't have a minimum threshold, because national systems need procurement rules for all levels. And then the World Bank and the other multilateral development banks, they've obviously got to think about funding projects and getting the money back. So all of those things will change slightly how the procurement system functions in practice.
I totally agree, because when you were saying that there was this effort for harmonization, I was thinking that I still feel like public procurement is still different. Even in the countries in the European Union, which is actually kind of harmonized. So for me, there are still huge differences. Would you really say it was harmonized at some point, or maybe only by some principles?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because we all follow the same principles. Everybody's signed up to the UN Convention Against Corruption. That means your procurement system must be focused on transparency, competition, and objective criteria and decision-taking. We've all agreed to that. And we've all agreed that we should have some form of open tendering or the open procedure in the EU. We've all agreed to that. And then some other procurement methods for other situations. So the basic procedural steps are harmonised. But countries are not harmonised. So look at Brazil and look at Angola, which is also a Portuguese-speaking country. They're both quite large, with mineral resources and so forth. And then go to Portugal, small, European country, speaks Portuguese, totally different commercial structure. So one of the things that UNCITRAL's work seeks to do, and I should say I'm no longer with UNCITRAL, I left a few years ago, but I carry on trying to implement national standards at the national level. And you can't implement them all the same. We want to harmonise, and that's the basis of UNCITRAL, is to try and harmonise the rules. But if your focus is on local procurement, everything from school meals through to local roads, local infrastructure, that's very different from if you're buying defence procurement or large infrastructure. And so one of the things I think that is really important is to recognise what rules tell you and what they're doing for you and what makes things work in practice. And the UNCITRAL model law is a little booklet like this, 70 pages long, so much smaller than the EU directives. The guide to putting that into your law and telling procurement agencies what regulations are needed and so on to make it work is a great fat thing, several hundred pages long. And that really, to me, is the important thing to take out from all of this. Implementing it is key. One of the things I think that is really possible now with modern e-procurement tools is that you can take a lot of the hard yards out of implementing rules through good systems. And if you think about how we have learnt to use internet-based purchasing, all of us in our everyday life, we don't think about what goes on behind it. We don't think when you click that button on Amazon or whatever, that's actually an electronic signature of a contract. Now, you can take that concept and have it through your e-procurement system so that the smallest municipality doesn't have to keep focusing on rules. It can use electronic catalogues and for all of the standard things, and it can have local systems that are integrated into the national system if you put the investment in, so that the user experience can be quite straightforward. Because on a practical level, if I'm a procurement official, I'm not really on a day-to-day basis bothered about whether the rule comes from the EU, the national government, the local government, or whatever it is. What are the rules I've got to follow? So if you consolidate all of those and have a system that's done all that for you, that tells you, right, you want to do this, this is the procedural step, it will then allow you to say, okay, I'm deciding to do this, this and this. You can explain that into your system, and you haven't got to keep looking up the rules. And this is where I think there's a big debate about simplification.
There is debate over always.
Yeah. and it doesn't work, right? We keep saying we want to simplify the rules. We can't simplify the rules because we keep adding on to procurement. It used to be lowest price, technically responsive tender, and make sure there's no corruption. That was what it was 30 years ago. Then we said, well, let's have what we now call the most advantageous or most economically advantageous tender. So we're looking at factoring quality. Well, that's complexity number one. Then we said, let's have environmental issues. That's complexity number two. Then we said, well, let's have SME policies or margins of preference or whatever. Complexity number 3. Now we've got social value added on top of that. So, and those are just the big policy areas. Well, that means everything is getting more complex. Markets are getting more complex. We have enough complexity there. What you need to do, in my view, is if you're going to have really complex philosophies and systems, i.e. the systems and the objectives that you want, you have to make the implementation easy. So instead of leaving it that each time you've got to navigate your way through all of these systems, that's what the role of more central government should be doing, saying, okay, we recognise the cost-benefit analysis of certain policies in certain sectors and help guide people through this so that the day-to-day user experience is more straightforward. I think what I'm seeing in practice, and I find it very, very disheartening actually, is so many officials trying to understand the rule. Now, I'm a lawyer, that's what I'm paid to do, right, is to understand rules. These people are procurement experts. They're experts in certain areas of commerce. Why are we trying to turn them into mini lawyers? That side of things should be taken away from them so that they can focus on what they're doing, which is the commercial side. And I don't see enough in the simplification debate about saying, well, if we want people to implement social value, for example, we've got to give them tools, not rules, but tools.
This is very much also what is going on in Slovakia. So as we discussed a little bit before recording this podcast, we have 3,000 municipalities. So can you imagine all of these organizations, even under the ministries, how many actually players have to mandatory process public procurement? And we are much more focused on controlling the processes than actually procure economically, let's say. And everybody's just trying to find the mistake in the process. Right. And it is very rare that you have really like controllers who truly focus on the result. And so suddenly this step-by-step process is much more important than the final product. Right. And so, of course, it is a nightmare for those on that level who have to mandatory procure, because of course if you have all these specialists and experts, no problem for them, but that's the illusion that this is the situation on the lowest level. Right. And now we can move a little bit also to the future, because as we know, on the European level it is now becoming even more complicated. So we know now there will be another responsibility on the contracting authority, which will be possibility to exclude third country economic operator. What do you think about this?
I think it's a reality, okay, that we have to confront. And decades ago, that was the norm in public procurement practice, right? Everybody wanted margins of preference, which is another way of excluding not local suppliers, because you would give local suppliers or economic operators 15% price preference, which has the effect of excluding, or can have the effect of excluding everybody else. It wasn't transparent, so people didn't really know how it was applied. But governments wanted to do that because they wanted to spend their own tax money locally. So this isn't a new issue, okay? What in UNCITRAL, because we were looking at trying to promote cross-border procurement, what did we encourage people to do? Look at whether it made sense to do this. If you have a small, fledgling domestic industry that you're trying to protect and trying to build up, it can make sense to give them some protection so that they grow to become internationally competitive. That we can understand. These things tend then to become permanent and outlive their use, right? You don't see them being removed. So we found that there were a lot of good fundamental approaches to try and build up industries that then became international competition distorting pieces of politics and policy. I don't know what the European Union is trying to achieve, or the Commission is trying to achieve with these things. Is it trying to do the equivalent of a Buy America? I'm not privy to those discussions. What would I say if somebody said to me, do you think this is a good idea in principle? I would say, well, not really. other than for industries where you need to build up your local capacity. And you may not be able to do that without some sort of specialist intervention. Governments are pretty bad at choosing those sectors, as a rule, a few exceptions. What does it do? It reduces competition. And what do we know about competition? Even a lawyer knows about competition. Better prices, better quality, better results. So I think there's a massive risk in doing this, not least because it's not just about each individual procurement. So in strategic sectors, there may be an argument for looking at, do we have within the European Union the capacity to manufacture our own steel? Do we have enough defence capacity? All those sorts of things. But on other areas, what we will probably end up doing is paying more for perhaps inferior products because the competition is less there. So that's on a substantive level. On the administrative level, if you've got a huge organisation, central government, they can have a department to deal with this. If you've got to do it right down to the bottom level, the administrative costs of doing this are enormous. Same goes for many other things, actually. Fair trade certification, eco-labels. All of these things actually have quite a lot of sense from some perspectives, but people aren't focusing enough on the costs, the administrative costs. And if you think about what is value for money in procurement, it's not just what you pay for what you buy, it's the cost of running the system. And so let's take jugs of water. If that jug costs, €5, but it costs us €50 in procedures to buy it, that's ridiculous, isn't it? We wouldn't know that. So we have to think very carefully about whether or not how governments will deal with this, because it may be under a certain threshold where international competition, which is well recognised, companies aren't going to move things overseas, across borders, in small contracts. So there's a very good argument for de minimis for this. There are the European thresholds in the directives. I don't know if they're intending to apply only above those thresholds, or if they're going to say, no, this is like a treaty provision, it's got to apply all the way through. So the first thing I would say to them is, don't put it below the thresholds.
I don't think we know now what is the real proposition. I think there are all these very strong discussion. Your example with the water. So do you truly think there is some real research or the data where we actually know if we are truly saving money by the public procurement procedures?
I'd like to say we do, but I'm not really sure. So the big change that I've seen in the last 10, 15 years is moving from using what we call e-procurement for external transparency to what I call internal transparency, so using data to see how we're doing. Business analytics tools can help us see trends, and I think a very good metric that we can look at is if a government is buying something that's available in the commercial market, how much more is the government paying for it? And that's basically the cost of the system, right?
What are the results so far?
I have not seen much analysis of this. There was some time ago some quite good work in the US talking about governments not spending enough time buying what they call COTS, that's commercial off-the-shelf items, preferring their own specifications. And I see a lot of that, okay? A lot of governments think, well, this is what I want, when they could actually get something that's pretty good in the market. So it's quite a complex thing to look at. Are we designing things for ourselves where we could go out into the market and just buy that or not? So the data from what I see, and I'm not a data expert, the data I don't think yet is as well advanced in the markets that I see. But I also work with the Open Contracting Partnership, which has an open contracting data standard. It's not an e-procurement system, but it helps put the data in a sort of machine-readable way so you can analyse it. And I'm really pleased to say that there are a lot of countries around the world now that are doing that, so I'm hopeful to see better things. And if you look at the OCP website, you will see quite a lot of results. But I don't think it's yet a system the norm. It's not mainstreamed. Some countries are doing it very well, some are starting.
So, for example, one example, imagine you are procuring, some construction or anything.
Yep.
When you are doing it as a public sector, that is now almost mandatory to always look green. Mm-hmm. So this will definitely make your contract more expensive.
I would take issue with that.
I just wanted to make the contrary example with the private sector.
Yeah.
Where, for example, this private company doesn't care that much because it's really only focusing to invest the least possible so that they can have the biggest profit. And that's why I'm asking if we truly think we are really investing the cheapest.
Right. That's why I say I take issue with, is the cheapest always, or is green always more expensive than the cheapest? The question is, who's paying for the environmental costs? It's just a question of how you're accounting for them. Someone has to pay for them. So it's really shifting. If you take, construction, maybe making concrete or cement or whatever, that has huge environmental costs. And up until fairly recently, the companies could just sort of ignore all of those and they were picked up by the general taxpayer. Doesn't mean that the costs weren't there. And procurement, it's not just procurement that requires green rules. There are now rules about production standards across countries. So I think we have to look at this in a fairly nuanced way. Also, some aspects of being green, life cycle costing, for example, is simply good business practice. It's a question of when you're paying for them. Where I think it gets much more complicated is if you're looking at general embedded carbon or carbon emissions more generally, so which are not linked to a particular contract, it's linked to the more general construction methodology and so on. And so I think it's very difficult to say being green always costs more. I don't think it does. Do I think that there's a pressure on public sector to be greener than the private sector? Well, up until fairly recently, I would have said not necessarily. Current geopolitics are going in a different direction. People are rowing back. That may be temporary. In terms of, do I think, therefore, that the public sector should be allowed to operate like the private sector and say, well, we don't care? Well, no, it's my money. I'm a taxpayer. I live in the place. If I have voted for a government because I want it to be greener, I expect that to be followed through. This is a very political question, and I think that it would be much more sensible to make all companies have to follow the same green standards. If you're applying them for public sector, they should apply to the private sector too.
So then what do you think about these European products that are now also in talkings? It is still not decided what truly is European product, so we don't know how will be the outcome. But we can truly assume the costs will be even higher.
Yeah, don't forget the European Union is a big place, so there are a lot of commercial possibilities here. But if you're going to start making the costs, the administrative costs, enormous, okay, so you've got to look at content, location, and things that go across borders 16 times. Where did you source the original materials? The costs of looking at that are enormous. And so that's going to do two things. It's going to make the direct cost of buying something more expensive, and it's going to drive a lot of people out of the public procurement market. When I've been doing research on SMEs, smaller companies, why they do or don't participate in public procurement, one of the things they tell us is that the overhead of selling to the government because of all of these requirements is so much higher. And also that governments are, on average, not very good purchasers because they change their mind and they pay late and all of that. So what I can see happening is that type of problem even on a bigger company scale. Because again, the companies are going to say, this is so complicated. We've had the same issue looking at, for example, trying to tackle modern slavery throughout supply chains. Fantastic idea, but very expensive to implement, particularly for smaller companies.
Exactly, but is this what we should... Is actually really... Are people really talking about this? Because I don't hear this that much, that actually with all these more and more requirements, what we are doing is that public procurement is not that good for the small businesses and supports medium or even larger companies. Nobody talks about this, but this is one of the indirect results of all these rules that we are now applying.
Well, here again, I think there's the threshold thing is really important. And you can have subcontractors as well in a larger contract. And I think it would be very sensible to start looking at what is appropriate for the really smaller companies and the really smaller contracts. We have all sorts of policy questions about inappropriate splitting, either not splitting or splitting too much to try and get round rules and so on. So you have to be very careful about how you implement this. But I think if you want your smaller businesses to grow, you're not going to do that by making the process so bureaucratic that they can't cope. So, and we also have to think about the implications. I mean, the 80-20 rule is supposed to apply in public procurement. 80% of the value is in 20% of the contracts, and the other way around. So the smaller contracts do add up, but they're not as big in terms of economic impact as the larger ones. So I think there is a good argument for smaller businesses. I mean, the analysis seems to be, from the data perspective, medium businesses do okay in procurement. Smaller businesses don't.
Even on the local level?
Proportionately across an economy, smaller businesses do not win as many procurement contracts as they should do. Medium-sized businesses more or less do. Now, behind that data, it's not disaggregated, so it's difficult to know. But let's also be honest, small and medium-sized businesses are 99.5% of businesses across the EU, so it's really not saying anything very much, other than very small businesses struggle to cope with government procurement requirements. And I think that's a reality that all governments at all levels should recognise. And going back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, I mean, when we buy off Amazon or eBay or any of those online sites, we're not thinking about the legal process that's behind it and what we're doing. That is, I mean, there are a lot of legal processes behind it, right? And so we should be thinking about small-scale government procurement from that perspective. That's how you make it straightforward. How can we do that? And the role of the governments is to say, we'll deal with all of these certifications separately if we're going to do it at all. So in India, for example, governments now have companies now, when you get started, have digital IDs. So it wouldn't be that hard here in Europe to say, okay, every company has a digital ID, and once, when you start, you identify areas, your areas of work, and you maybe once get a whole load of certifications, and it's there on your digital ID. You don't need to submit it separately. You know, there are ways of looking at these things completely outside the box that don't mean that you have special rules for procurement. I think that's one of the big issues. Too many rules in the procurement side of things that could be actually just rolled out in a digital way across the entire corporate
I'm also
landscape.
interested, since I know you're British, what is now the difference since Brexit about the British procurement procedures and European Union?
Okay. I don't pretend to be an expert in either British or European procurement, let's be clear. But both the UK, post-Brexit, and the EU are members of the World Trade Organisation's GPA. So the fundamentals of their system have to align with the GPA. And the British have now a new government procurement, or new procurement act, and it's been in place for just over a year now. And what I would say is it is procedurally more flexible than the EU directives.
Interesting.
Yep, and it also puts a very high emphasis on data, the Open Contracting Data Standard, and so on. So it wants to be very transparent. So I think that's very good. Where I think that I have a little more concern, and this is very high-level stuff, is that contracting authorities can set up their own procedures. And I'm a little bit worried about fragmentation across the system for the reasons that we've been talking about. But basically, the fundamentals are there. They haven't changed that much. There's been a little bit of changing of terminology, which I think might be more procedural than substantive. But there's not that much difference. And let's face it, British companies want to export to the EU and the EU want to sell into the UK. So there's a lot of sense in keeping these things as standard as possible.
Of course, we still need each other.
That's right. That's right.
Would you have some last comments you would like to share with our listeners?
Well, thank you. I think, we've talked about quite a few areas. I think I would say the thing about public procurement is it really matters. Now, the numbers in there are very difficult to be precise about, but, $1 in 6 or 7 worldwide spent on public procurement, 15% or so of GDP, and it builds our major infrastructure and it gives all the services to people. So it really matters. And I'm pleased to see that there's a lot more emphasis on it now than there used to be. I remain concerned that the emphasis tends to be on rules rather than outcomes. And the one thing that I think that we have not yet tackled properly is incentive structures. Because if I'm a procurement official, my performance will be judged on getting things done nicely, smoothly, no bid protests, no challenges, no court cases and so on. That's a big disincentive to innovate because that's a risk. So I'd like to see, along with this, how can we do things better? How do we deal with this incentive problem? And I would also very much like to see a more mainstream approach to embedding any of what I will call the non-procurement criteria, environmental, social, and all of that, across the board so that the procurement system is not viewed as so different from the rest of the commercial market. So if those are our values, if we want to be greener and socially more responsible, then that should be the same across the field, so that there's less distinction between public and private from that perspective. I'd love to see simpler rules. We're not going to do that. So let's be realistic. So what we need to do is to take those rules and turn them into really good tools so that for procurement officials on a day-to-day basis, they're not struggling with increasing complexity more than in terms of outcomes.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I appreciate that you could come to our podcast and we could discuss. You are listening to the podcast of Public Procurement Office with Petra Šupáková.
Thank you very much.
Podcast of the PPO. Podcast about everything from the world of public procurement.